Hello and welcome to the Fat Tailed Thoughts podcast. My name's Stephen Dickens. I'm your co-host, and I'm joined as always by my dear friend Jared Clee. Hey, Jared, welcome to the show.
Good morning, Stephen. How are you?
So, yeah, I'm good. I'm good. So this is episode 8 of our show that we're pulling together here. Please go and check out the other episodes. I've managed to convince Jared to write something topical this week in the newsletter. So you'll be glad to know we're not doing part 3 of paper in banking and optical character recognition. For those of you who've listened to the previous shows, we thought we did a good enough job by covering that in 2 topics. So this is the first of what's going to be a multi-part series covering inflation. Lots of heat and noise around this topic. So, Jared, without further ado, because we never stick to time, let's dive straight into what is a huge topic. Just get us orientated for the listeners, what they can expect in the show today.
So inflation's all over the news, Stephen. It's even if you're under a rock, I don't think you could miss it. Even if you're not watching the news and you go to the grocery store, you go to the gas pump, or you're, heaven forbids, you're trying to buy a car right now. Prices have been going up and up and up and up. And we're, for the time being, we'll ignore the drivers, etc. The real question is, how on earth do you measure that? I mean, if you just think about the challenge, ignore all of the services we buy, the hair cutters or what have you. Just imagine trying to go to the grocery store and measure the average change in prices across all of the stuff in the grocery store. I mean, it is a monumental task. So as a result, what happens is we have what's called the headline inflation number, what we'll come back to, the CPI, Consumer Price Index. And that's been, the past month, November, was measured at 6.8% year over year change. And that's the highest number in decades at this point. But that may or may not actually be the right number.
So let's get right into this. You mentioned CPI. There's going to, for the newsletter, if you've not read that, highly recommend you do. We'll put the link in the show notes. But there's a lot of acronyms in there. Let's start foundationally. What is this thing? Who creates it? Where is it reported on a monthly basis? Let's just get that out of the way, hopefully quickly, and then we can dive into the mechanics of how it's created and how it's calculated.
The Consumer Price Index is the quote unquote average basket of goods and services that an American purchases. Now, there's a lot that goes in that, and hence average basket goods and services purchased by an American consumer. So that's assembled by the Bureau of Labor Statistics, which commissioner is appointed by the president, and then you've got about 1,000-person organization underneath that. That bureau goes out and does a tremendous number of surveys with a remarkably complex methodology to go collect both the goods information, like what should go in this basket, goods and services, as well as the price information, how much does it cost right now? And it's, as we'll get into the weeds here in a sec, it's the roll-up of that effort that generates the Consumer Price Index. And then they're measuring the month-over-month or year-over-year change of saying it was at 110 last month, it's at 112 this month, or what have you.
And that's the first thing for me that is kind of the issue here. So I'll maybe be the voice of the listener here. You've got people going out and running surveys. So if you look at, and we'll get on to owner's equivalent rent and housing, there is some pretty accurate data sources, pick Zillow, Realtor.com, other data sources that are getting direct signal from the market of listings of homes and listings of rent. Why are we going out and surveying people? That sounds very sort of 1970s way of doing data collection when there's larger data sets that are more accurate. Just, I mean, is that a legacy hangover? Is that just the way we've always done it? What's your take there?
There's a couple things that go into it, Stephen, and as we'll come back to in more depth, yes, the right to be a bit skeptical there is certainly some truth to the conspiracy theorists here.
Well,
But
I mean, just on that, I don't think it's a conspiracy theory to say Zillow has got very accurate market data
correct.
around
The
rent.
conspiracy side comes in and says, no, government's squashing the real inflation numbers. And
I mean, that's the other side of that
right.
equation. I'm just saying, just purely take rhetoric out of it, purely take whether I want the CPI to be higher or lower, or whether I'm a Bitcoin maximalist trying to push that as, buy Bitcoin versus invest in fiat. It just to me seems a little strange that we're going out surveying sort of tens of thousands of people to find their rent when Zillow's got a data set of probably every renter in the US lists their rental property on Zillow, or maybe even sort of realtor.com. Maybe it's the aggregate of 2 or 3 websites, but it wouldn't be hard for the Bureau of Labor to connect to those data sources and say, give me a direct API feed of real estate values, and then to put them into a calculation. I think you and I could write that API. It wouldn't be hard. So just maybe why is that not happening, do you think?
So let's balance considerations here. So we have a basket of goods and services, Stephen, of which housing is one. So first point is, for the vast majority of stuff in that basket, TVs and mayonnaise and cars and what have you, you don't have readily available price data. We've actually seen you make faces.
I'm sure Walmart and Target and Macy's and Best Buy are tracking that type of data from a price point of view.
You would think so, but again, one is the availability of that data, two, where those goods are purchased. So part of, and again, we'll get in the methodology here, the CPI is a sample of samples. One of those samples is the mix of stores, the mix of vendors where goods are bought. So rather than just relying on a Walmart or a Target or whatnot to give you the price data, part of the calculation of the CPI is actually going and figuring out, where do people buy these things? And then samples of those specific stores, Stephen, are where they go get the prices from. So that if it turns out in a neighborhood, say I live in Brooklyn, in a neighborhood in Brooklyn, most of the groceries are actually picked up at the corner store as opposed to the grocery store. If that corner store happens to get picked, you're going to end up with elevated price inputs for the local neighborhood, which is in fact reflective of how people here may be spending their money, even though you could get it more cheaply somewhere else.
So I think this is the nuanced discussion here that gets lost in the rhetoric and people picking a side of where they want to be. There is both good and bad in either model. In my suggested model, hook up a bunch of APIs to Walmart, Target, Best Buy, Realtor.com, and Zillow, you would form maybe a larger data set, but not necessarily reflective of your buying habits of picking up a pint of milk from the local corner store that's getting sampled. So
correct.
I think, and this is the nuance that never seems to find its way into the conversation, this is making the best of a bad job, I think, from just how we calculate it.
It's a good way of putting it. And we'll come back to it. There actually was an effort, Stephen, to do something similar to what you're articulating. It does not exist anymore. We'll come back to why. Let's come back to the methodology, because we're starting to step our way into it. But we'll do it a bit more formally here. So let's start with that basket. The basket of goods and services we just generically call items in the basket. That's a really hard problem, because Stephen, what I purchase at home is likely different than what you purchase at home, is likely different than what most of our listeners purchase on a day-to-day basis. And again, that's going to include everything from your groceries to your TV, to your appliances, to your clothes, to your hair cutters, to your medical bills, to what have you. I mean, it's the full swath of stuff. For the CPI, it will include either your rent or what they call rent equivalent, which we'll come back to.
So building that picture of the average American,
correct,
that probably doesn't exist. So there's the first.
Correct. There's no place to go get that. So the Bureau of Labor Statistics actually assembles it. What they do is survey data, and they go out to on a quarterly basis about 12,000 consumers, and they go and ask, "What did you purchase?" For stuff that is purchased more frequently, like groceries, kind of on a daily or weekly basis, they go out to yet another group of consumers and ask them to maintain 2-week diaries throughout the year and inventory all of the stuff that they bought line item by line item throughout that period. Now, to be clear here, Stephen, with both that initial survey and with the diaries, at this point, we do not care about the price of those goods. What we care about is what goods were bought. Now, this is where it gets quite nuanced. You can imagine, Stephen, that somebody goes out and says, I bought milk. Well, that actually is an enormous category in and of itself. You could be buying skim milk. You could be buying whole milk. You could be buying half and half could get thrown in there. You could be buying a gallon. You could be buying a half gallon. You could be buying a pint. Or you may be buying en masse because you have an enormous fridge and you do bakery stuff at home and you ship it out and you need tons of it. You can end up.
You're talking about my house with 4 kids who all bake on a regular basis, and we
exactly
buy
gallons and gallons.
Yeah, there's at least probably 3 gallons of milk in my fridge at any one point.
Wild.
Yeah, it's crazy. And this, I mean, I mention it flippantly, but just as one category, my milk buying habits are very different probably to your milk buying habits.
I do not have 4 kids at my home, at least not that I'm aware of, and it's not that big, so they'd have hard time hiding.
You might have 4 kids not at your home, but that's
I don't have 4 kids in general, Stephen. So
yeah,
I have a dog, but he doesn't drink all that much milk, so we're safe on that front.
Yeah, but I mean, it's a kind of flippant way to illustrate the point of we're not that unsimilar as people. Correct. You know, similar backgrounds, how we work, the same sort of job, relatively similar income, not that far apart in age. But you just look at our milk purchasing habits. I'm one end of the scale, you're probably the other end of the scale. So trying to form that picture of the average American, even for a demographic that is so similar like ours, can be wildly different just on one point.
It's a great example. So what ends up at the end of kind of all of this survey, the net total, it's over 80,000 items that get inventory, Stephen. I mean, it's just shocking slice of what the American life looks like. So once that basket, by the way, is updated on a semi-regular basis, I believe about every 2 years or so, they go and they revisit it. There is, and we'll come back, there's an alternate measure that updates it on a more regular basis called the chained CPI, which we'll come back to. Once you have the basket, the next question is, where is that stuff actually purchased from? And this is what we were hitting on before with the grocery store and the corner store. So yet another survey goes out, Stephen, and they ask, where did you purchase stuff from? And they get all of the possible places. That then provides input number 2. That input then actually gives you the price data itself. So
I had one question when I was reading the newsletter. You know, you and I are based in the same state. You're in Brooklyn. I'm up in the sticks in New York State. I can imagine my price of milk is different from your price of milk if we just stay on milk for a moment. But I'd imagine in rural Wisconsin, the price of milk's a whole different price again. Is that fully regionalized and they've got that ability to be able to pull New York City, regional New York, and, you know, rural Wisconsin and aggregate those prices out? Is that part of the metric also?
So the CPI that's reported is urban, quote unquote, urban CPI. You'll see it denoted as CPI-U. That accounts for 93% of the population of the US. So, Stephen, from a zip code standpoint, you and I are likely being included in the CPI. I guarantee there are places in Wisconsin that are being excluded from that calculation.
But I think, and this was the point and where my question was going, 93% of the population, you can look at that statistic one of two different ways. Yes, we're excluding 7% of the population, but hey, we're basing it off 93% of the population. So again, the conspiracy theorists can form an opinion that this is excluding 7% of Americans, but from a statistical point of view and directionally, 93% I think is a good metric.
And if we just coming back to the milk, the variance you're going to have in milk when we start talking about housing prices or what we call shelter, the cost of actually staying there, it's going to be wildly different between where I am in Brooklyn and where you are up in the sticks.
Yeah, for sure. For sure.
So that's again, it does. When we say average, we really do mean average. It's including all of this variance bundled up. So we talked before, we've got that product mix from going out and surveying people on a quarterly basis. We then include those for 2 years. We then get the places we purchase them from a different survey. I believe it's about 14,500 people. Where do you buy stuff? The price data then comes from the combination of those two. So someone at the Bureau or again via survey will actually go to the store or will contact the store and say, for a pint of organic whole milk, what is the price today? And then on a monthly basis for the next 2 years, they will call them up again and ask for that exact same thing, the same SKU, and say, what's the price? What's the price? What's the price? Now, how do we get that specific pint, that specific brand, etc.? The answer is random sampling. So they go back to that basket and they take the entire category of, say, whole milk. And they say, I've seen 5 types of organic whole milk from this brand and 4 from that brand and 3 that are normal and 20 that are pint size. And they take the probability of any individual type ending up in that basket, and then simple random sampling, they say, okay, which product should we pick from the store? It's a probability distribution over all the types of pints of whole milk, and they pick one that stays in the sample for 2 years.
So I think the takeaway here, and we'll maybe use this as an inflection point in the call, is you can knock the way they go and get this data. You can question, but I think and part of my work is working on research and doing sampling size. The sample sizes are big enough. The methodologies are solid enough. The sample sizes, the way they're conducting the research, and there's a level of consistency month over month that gives us directionally a data point that we can point to, and the market has pointed to, of it's now 6.8, it used to be 6.2, we want it to be 2. That trend line is a consistent trend line that's calculated the same way. So I think that's been really foundational. Obviously, a huge part of the newsletter was, if that's one set of calculations and one methodology, there is other ways you can skin this cat and other ways you can do this calculation. So maybe we'll use this as a sort of putting a pin in the conversation around CPI and how the Bureau of Labor does it. And now we'll pivot to, what are those other measures? How are they calculated? Pros and cons almost. So maybe just go through some of the methodologies that you highlighted in the newsletter.
So there are a couple major errors, potential sources of error in the CPI that drive those alternatives. One of them, Stephen, that you hit on is the data sources. So there was an initiative a number of years ago called the Billion Prices Project that no longer exists. And the challenge there is, as I walk through the CPI methodology, you can imagine the cost, simply the expense to go out and get that type of methodology, get it reviewed, get it updated, and then engage the tens of thousands of consumers on a monthly basis to gather that data. It's simply massively expensive. the challenge of the Billion Prices Project, they tried to launch that as a retail for free. Here's an alternative measure. They simply didn't make the money they needed to. They sold out. They through a number of steps, sold out to State Street, and they now continue to publish that, but only proprietary and only to State Street's customers. So they, by the way, to your suggestion, did the online scraping data, et cetera, go generate that. But it exists. We have it. It needs a revenue stream that actually works.
You've got to pay for it to get it as a data source from State Street, basically. Now. Okay.
So a different challenge, which the CPI does, rather the Bureau does address, is stuff gets more expensive. And I jokingly put in there, lump crab, Dungeness lump crab, just skyrocketed to $60 a pound earlier this year. And unless you're my brother on his birthday, which he did too, you're probably not going to buy as much crab anymore. He was insistent, so we did help with this.
And your point is a substitution point. Something gets too expensive, I'll substitute that thing for this cheaper alternative that kind of services the same need. And I think it's really interesting we're seeing this going on at scale with gasoline and electric vehicles. So Dungeness crab is kind of a fun way to frame the discussion, but people are making car purchases, fuel purchases based on a reaction to that price of fuel. So this substitution, whilst Dungeness crab is kind of one data point, this does happen. You know, people are deciding to move from various parts of the country because it's expensive to live in Brooklyn and it's cheaper to go and live in Wisconsin. And if you can work remote, you can change. So these types of substitutions are a major point, I think.
Correct. And we have an alternative calculation, again, put together by the Bureau called the chained CPI. So the regular CPI, as I said, keeps that basket of goods and the weighting among that basket stable over 2 years. The chained CPI says accounts for the substitution effect among goods, meaning allows you to change the weightings among those 80,000 potential items in a period-to-period basis. And as a result, what you see is as people substitute away from high-cost goods to low-cost goods, you have a slightly lower inflation rate.
So is that, and it's interesting that to me seems more representative. You know, we'll go back to Dungeness crab. If you go to the supermarket and you're looking there in the deli aisle and you look, wow, that crab's expensive. We're going to have something seafood on a Friday. I'll get shrimp instead. That's actually the type of thought process as a consumer that would go through. I like crab. I prefer crab, but I'm not paying that price for it. I'm going to get shrimp instead because I've got this much in my budget. Why is that not the metric? And we're using the other CPI metric.
So that comes with its own errors, Stephen. The answer is this is always trade-offs. Another error, and they actually gets probably exacerbated by the substitution effect, is changes in quality of goods. So you can imagine the same quote unquote good. We see this, by the way, with chip bags, what you would call crisps, by the way, just for clarity.
Thanks for that clarification. Yes, for our international listeners, chips are a very different thing to crisps. You have chips on a Friday with your fish on top and wrap them in we could go on.
But if you, and this happened during 2008, I think it's happened again recently. You can go check at your grocery store. You get the same size bag with less and less chips in it, which drives me absolutely nuts.
Shrinkflation, I think, is the phrase.
Yes, but that is fundamentally, that is a change in quality. In theory, I'm buying the same thing. In reality, I'm getting a worse product for it. We can imagine if you buy anything that's pre-made, a swapping out of ingredients. Maybe they swapped out olive oil and they put in veggie oil or what have you, a cheaper substitute. In theory, you're buying the same thing. In reality, you're buying a more inferior quality good. That's another source error. It simply does not show up in the CPI numbers, but it's more likely to show up in the chain CPI. Reason being is that why is that other good cheaper? Well, in part perhaps because the quality is worse.
Yeah. So let's maybe move off the Bureau of Labor calculated statistics and maybe sort of move to some of those others. You've in the newsletter. I don't know where you find these things when you do your research, but the Big Mac
Oh,
index.
Stephen, I love the Big Mac index. That's why.
Well, I think that's got an international context as well. I've seen The Economist do this as a way to sort of gauge. It's a good that's sold pretty much the same product, and McDonald's do a fantastic job of creating these at bulk and creating the same product in many markets. I've had Big Macs when I've been in Beijing and just I need to eat lunch. I don't want to do the lottery of being able to go into some local food vendor. I know exactly what I'm getting, and it will be exactly the same as it was on the street in New York. So I think that's an interesting one, both from within the US, but also from an international perspective.
That's the story of Usain Bolt eating chicken nuggets before the Beijing Olympics.
Yeah. I'm a quarter pounder with cheese person. Personally, if you want to add bacon to it, adding bacon is always a good idea.
Always, no matter what the question is.
Yeah, whatever the question, would you like bacon with that? Is the answer's probably yes.
And who says we don't give useful advice, Stephen?
Yeah, I mean, yes, that actually is investment advice. Go buy stocks and shares in a bacon producer because it's always going to be the answer. So no, I mean, joking aside, let's get back to some of the other.
So the Big Mac index is a good one, Stephen, and you're right. Originally, it was actually assembled by The Economist to do kind of finger in the air math on currency wars, rather weakness and strength in currency, because the expectation was a Big Mac should be relatively the same relative price in one country versus another. So if the pound is strong against the dollar or the euro is weak against the dollar, you're going to see the price of Big Mac in euros change versus the dollar. What it's also good for is measuring the change in the price of a Big Mac over time. So you can compare the change in price of a Big Mac versus the predicted change in price based on CPI to measure, is CPI tracking inflation correctly? Now, really what we're doing under the covers, Stephen, is with the Big Mac is we're measuring two things. One is the cost of the goods and services that go into a Big Mac, the meat, the bun, etc. We could sing the song, but we'll avoid it for this morning.
There's actual meat in a Big Mac. Sorry.
And two, what does get baked in there is the brand power of McDonald's. Now, that's a funny one that really shouldn't get embedded in inflation, but in the Big Mac index is getting captured. And I highlight in another context, Shadow Stats, which is fully debunked at this point, but predicts a different inflation number that's way above what the CPI is. If you go look at the predicted price changes, there's a nice chart in the letter. If you look at the predicted price changes in groceries from the 1980s to today, you'll see that inflation does a somewhat good job. It's within about 9% of accurate for most of the goods, chuck roast, bread, etc. The ones that gets wrong, among others, are Pepsi. And part of what you're looking at in there, Stephen, is Pepsi is able to increase prices faster than inflation because it has brand power.
It'll go and spend more money to improve its brand perception, its relative worth to a consumer. Drinking Pepsi's cool. It's not a utilitarian sort of asset.
Correct.
There's a brand equity that you can factor into that.
Correct. So other alternative measures here as we talk about, there's one big one we need to talk about, personal consumption expenditures. That is the preferred metric used by the Fed, by the Federal Reserve Bank to measure changes in inflation. That is assembled by a different government organization. There are a number of meaningful differences between that and the CPI. The biggest one is CPI measures what you and I spend, Stephen. That includes monies that are spent on our behalf. The biggest one of those in the US is medical insurance. So when you and I go into the doctor, we pay a small amount of what the doctor actually ends up receiving. Most of that is paid by the insurer to the doctor. We are not directly involved in the transaction. CPI simply ignores that transaction takes place, whereas the measure used by the Fed does. So as a result, when you look at that basket of goods and services, the weightings change quite dramatically because all of a sudden we're including medical expenditures.
Okay. So as we always endeavor to keep ourselves to a half an hour podcast and completely fail, and we're 30 minutes and a few seconds in, maybe start to summarize up for us, both me and the listeners, really what we can take away from the newsletter, where we are on sort of CPI as a metric as a whole, where you see the validity of some of these other metrics, and just really, I suppose, provide that nuanced view to strip back the rhetoric and give us a view of kind of where do you see CPI as an overall measure.
So the methodology, Stephen, behind CPI is remarkably strong. That's not to say there aren't errors. That's not to say there aren't problems with it. That's not to say it can't get better. But the place to start is this is a sincere effort. It's well published. It's well reviewed. The data is available. You and I can, and anyone listening can go and download the data and play around. There is no limitation. There's nothing being quote unquote hidden here. So any potential issues with it come with, I don't like the methodology, or I think you're gathering data the wrong way, or the data is bad. There's no hidden pieces here. That said, it is important to keep in mind the Charlie Munger quote, "Show me the incentives and I'll show you the outcome." We have a number of government expenditures that are linked to CPI. That creates a massive incentive to depress the CPI numbers. So even though it's well published, you've got a perverse incentive there. So the expectation should be that insofar as the Bureau is able to, within the limitations of good science, good statistics, they're going to depress that number. So you have alternate calculations that provide a different view. Stephen, one of my favorites outside the Big Mac Index is the American Institute of Economic Research uses the same exact data from that's collected by the Bureau and calculates what they call the everyday price index. That everyday price index measures stuff that, by their definition, we purchase on a day-to-day basis. So things like housing are excluded, big purchases like cars and appliances are excluded. What they're looking at is your grocery bill, what you pay at the haircutters, etc. And what we've seen there, again, published methodology, relying on the same data. And what we have seen there is actually inflation in excess of what's reported by the CPI. Interestingly, they publish an alternative version of that includes expenditures on apparel. And coming back to the comments on substitution effect, that number is actually lower than CPI. And reason being is that over time, we've seen fast fashion and the like, cost of clothing has gotten cheaper and cheaper, mostly due to a decline in quality of goods. So I really
sweatpants are cheaper than suits.
Exactly.
So, I mean,
it's a good example. I leave this one up to the listeners because it's what you have there, and it's the last chart in the letter this week. You have on that chart the everyday price index calculated from the same data as the CPI, and you have the everyday price index including apparel, and you've got this reasonably wide spread of reported numbers, all based on the same data, all with reasonable methodologies, simply looking at different slices of our lives and how we spend money. And the answer is you get 3 different results.
Yeah. And you can layer a conspiracy theory over that to whichever one you want to pick. So as I mentioned at the top of the podcast, this is the first of what's going to be a multi-part series. What can the listeners expect next week?
So much to my dismay, Stephen, we have seen all over the news, all over Twitter, all over any place you look hard enough, people talking about quote unquote hyperinflation.
Jack Dorsey
Oh, God.
owning a Twitter platform is kind of interesting. He gets to put out whatever he wants and can shape the discussion for sure.
The discussion on hyperinflation is garbage and unfounded. And to be
that's the
clear
topic
here,
for next week as you look to debunk that.
it's not even debunk, it's to explain what hyperinflation is first and then go through and debunk it, both looking at the situation we're in here, Stephen, and what hyperinflation actually looks like.
Fantastic.
And that's, as I kindly termed at the end of the letter, I'm calling what we have here hyped inflation as opposed to actual hyperinflation.
I think there's a title for next week's newsletter there somewhere. So you've been listening to the Fat Tailed Thoughts podcast. I'm your co-host, Stephen Dickens. You've been listening to Jared Clear also. As always, the complaints department is directed to Cleebeard on Twitter. The praise department's linked to @StephenDickens3. All joking aside, we love feedback and interaction from our listeners. If you like what you've heard today, please click and subscribe. If you really like what you listen to today, tell your friends and give us a review. You've been listening to the Fat Tailed Thoughts podcast. Thank you very much for listening, and we'll see you again next week for another episode. Thanks very much.